This week, our discussion is going to focus on how the newly independent United States set about the task of creating a federal government. In the beginning, prior to the Revolution, it was relatively easy to get all 13 colonies to support the idea of independence. However, after victory was achieved in the Revolution, it becomes a far more challenging task getting all 13 states to agree on how best to govern themselves in the years following independence. The story of creating a federal government actually begins before the Revolution. In the spring of 1776, just prior to the Declaration of Independence, the Continental Congress advised the 13 colonies to create new state governments that replace their old colonial charters with state constitutions. So over the course of the war, all 13 colonies converted themselves from a colony into a state by creating these individual state constitutions. In all 13 cases, there was a governor and a legislature, legislature of elected representatives, and a court system. In most cases, the state legislature appointed the governor and the members of the court. But so in the beginning, only the legislative representatives were elected by the people. What was also common among all 13 of these state governments was a Bill of Rights. All 13 of these state constitutions included some variation of a Bill of Rights, some specific protections for the rights of individuals within that state. So this process of creating state governments actually began before the war even started. And then over the course of the war, they refined this and get all these state constitutions ironed out. It's a little bit different story with the federal government. Once the war started, our Continental Congress began to function as a federal government for the purpose of coordinating the war effort of the 13 states. In so doing, they drafted the Articles of Confederation, and this was basically our first form of federal government here in the United States. This is in 1777, again about within the first year of the war. Congress drafts these Articles of Confederation, and this is basically an outline of how Congress will function as a federal government until such time as it is revised. And this Articles of Confederation will be our form of government all the way up till about 1789. So for about a little more than 10 years, about 10 or 12 years, these Articles of Confederation will be our primary governing document. Essentially what the Articles do, they created a federal government. It only has one branch of government, and that's Congress. Basically, our Continental Congress becomes the federal government with the adoption of this document. Unlike our federal government today, there's only one branch of government. Today, of course, we have an executive branch, a legislative branch, and a judicial branch. Our federal government under the Articles has only one branch, our Congress, and it is a unicameral Congress, meaning only one house, compared to today where there's a House of Representatives and a Senate, a lower and an upper house. This Congress underneath the Articles of Confederation has only one house. So it's quite a bit, at the federal level, government is quite a bit different than it is today. This government under the Articles of Confederation was very weak, and this is important to really emphasize this. This was not a mistake. It was not an oversight. It was not due to their lack of governing skill. They designed it on purpose to be very weak. Most of the power in the United States for these years is going to be held by the state governments. The individual state governments, with their constitutions, will hold most of the power in the United States. This federal government under the Articles of Confederation are going to be very, very weak, very limited power. Essentially, the powers held by this federal government under the Articles are limited to just a few specific things. The federal government can organize and operate a postal service. they can manage foreign policy and national defense. These are the only three areas of concern that the federal government will have any power of. And a lot of these seem kind of intuitive when you think about the situation under which these articles were created. They're in the middle of a war for independence. Postal service is going to be kind of an essential feature as far as communication. They don't want to rely on existing British postal networks because they're fighting the British. So they want to create their own network of communication. So post office seems kind of intuitive there. Foreign policy, again, they believe that the war will eventually end and they'll have to negotiate some sort of treaty. And so Congress gives themselves the power to conduct foreign policy. And national defense, another obvious task here. They're in the midst of the war, and this is kind of the primary function of Congress for the war years, at least, is coordinating the war effort during the Revolution. The Articles of Confederation specify that Congress did not have the power to regulate trade, raise troops, or impose taxes. This is very important. They specify these things. The federal government will not have anything to do with trade or raising an army or imposing taxes. And this is no real surprise considering how upset the colonies had been with British trade regulations and imposing taxes and all the tension and confusion surrounding the presence of British troops. You know, it's no surprise that Congress votes to prevent these powers from being held by the federal government. So this is the situation we have during the Revolutionary War, is that our Congress, now functioning as a federal government under these Articles of Confederation, exists primarily to coordinate the war effort, and they have very few other additional powers. After the war, once independence is achieved, and we are now setting about the task of trying to govern ourselves as a newly independent nation, the situation will change a little bit. Many people will see less of a need for a federal government in the years after the war, and and again, this was kind of foreseen by Congress. They wanted to create a federal government to help coordinate the war effort, and once that goal was achieved, a lot of people felt there was no longer a need for a federal government. In fact, in the minds of many people, especially at the state level, these 13 states now were independent states, free to go their own way, 13 different directions, 13 different ways of doing things. The federal government was not really a factor in a lot of their plans. So initially, the federal government doesn't really do anything. In fact, these two land ordinances that we're getting ready to talk about here in a minute are pretty much the only achievements of the federal government under the Articles of Confederation. They did very little else. So to this task of organizing the frontier, this is basically our only real achievement of this federal government under the Articles. It seems like kind of a small task, but when you really start to look at it, this is really an important task, because it's going to set a pattern for frontier settlement and the creation of new states for the next 100 years. So this really, what they do here in these land ordinances, is really going to help establish a long-term impact on the future of the United States. To begin with, we should probably refresh our memory on exactly what we're talking about when we talk about the frontier. If you remember, per the Treaty of Paris, 1783, the United States gained all the territory between the Great Lakes and Florida and the Mississippi River and the Atlantic coast. So all of this is now United States territory. How are we going to organize this frontier territory? And when we talk about the frontier at this point, we're talking about everything between the Appalachian Mountains, which runs from Maine down to northwest part of Georgia. So these Appalachian Mountains, beyond these Appalachian Mountains is the frontier. This is all Indian territory. There's very few settlers living in this area in the immediate aftermath of the Revolution. So a lot of people want to move out here. If you remember back in the French and Indian War, after that war was over, a lot of people wanted to move onto the frontier, but the British government said no, wanted to avoid conflict with the Indians. Now that this is our territory, we want to decide for ourselves how best to use it, and settling this frontier is of primary importance now to a lot of people. So the federal government now is going to try and organize this so that the settlement of the frontier, and we're talking specifically about this Northwest Territory, all the territory north of the Ohio River. We want to make sure that it happens in an organized fashion. So this is where our land ordinances come into play. One of the reasons that Congress wanted to get involved with this is that each state kind of had its own idea about how to settle the frontier. When you got 13 different states all suggesting 13 different ways of settling the frontier, it can get very confusing, as you can see on this map. This map is a kind of a representation of how or what some of the proposals were at the time to settle this frontier. As you can see, it's kind of chaotic and confusing here, with some of the larger colonies like Virginia claiming territory up here in the Great Lakes area, and then some of these other frontier areas being claimed by more than one state. See Virginia's name on a lot of these little sections here. Virginia had a lot of ambitious land claims at this point. And then of course you see down here states like South Carolina being left with this tiny sliver of land that's about 400 miles long and about 35 or 40 miles wide. When we look at this map, it seems, from our perspective now looking back, it seems ridiculous to plan out a map in this fashion. So this brings us to our land ordinance of 1785. What this does basically is establish the pattern for settlement, how the frontier area is going to be settled physically out there on the ground. What are we doing out there on the frontier in terms of actually building physical settlements? Also, what it does is it sets up a pattern for how this land is going to be dispersed. Technically, according to the Treaty of Paris 1783, all of this land was ceded to the United States government by the government of England. So all this land on the frontier technically belongs to Congress, the federal government. So Congress is going to begin selling this land for about $1 an acre. And they do this as a means of generating revenue. Keep in mind, Congress does not have the power to tax at this point. So their only source of revenue is this land, the sale of this land. So they're going to use this, the proceeds from this land sale to start paying off their war debts. And of course, there are many war debts, many millions of dollars that the federal government owes in terms of debt incurred during the war. So this is going to be our primary source of revenue for several years, is the sale of this frontier land. Our Northwest Ordinance of 1787, again, it's referring to the same region, the same part of the territory, that territory north of the Ohio River. This ordinance will be concerned primarily with establishing a government on the frontier. How exactly are we going to govern these people once they begin moving onto the frontier? To begin with, what will happen is that as long as there's or initially, as soon as the territory is organized into broken down into smaller territories, Congress will appoint a governor and 3 judges to govern that particular territory. And this will be the case as long as there's less than 5,000 adult males living in that territory. So for those first few years of settlement, less than 5,000 adult males, Congress will appoint a governor and 3 judges to rule in that territory. Once that territory has achieved more than 5,000 adult males, and we're referring to adult males here because they're the only people who are eligible by law to vote in any elections. So more than 5,000 adult males, the people of that territory can elect a legislature. So here we're seeing the beginnings of a government being established based on the population of that territory. And of course the magic number here is 60,000. Once the total population of that territory reaches more than 60,000, and this is total people, men, women, children, everybody. Once the total population is 60,000 or more, then the settlers in that territory can draft a constitution and apply for statehood, at which time they will become a full-fledged member of the United States. They will join the Union as a state, and they'll be authorized to have representation in Congress and every other privilege and right that all the rest of the original 13 states enjoy. So this Northwest Ordinance is very important because it establishes a system of government on the frontier while they are waiting to become a state, and of course it provides a path to statehood. And this will kind of help solve the idea of, okay, these United States will be more than just the original 13 states spread all the way across the continent. It provides a way of creating new states out of frontier territories. So Land Ordinance of 85, we are establishing a pattern of settlement, physically how the territory is going to be settled. And the Northwest Ordinance of 87 establishes a pattern of governance and a path to statehood. Taking a look at a map here, this diagram shows the area we're talking about. Both of these ordinances focus primarily on this territory north of the Ohio River in the Great Lakes area. And again, this was kind of the primary destination of most of the settlers. They were coming across the Appalachian Mountains, down the Ohio River, into this region of what is today Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. And of course, they were traveling along the Great Lakes into this territory as well. So this is the primary destination of most settlers. There was the most immediate need for organization in this region. When we zoom in, we can see how the settlement pattern is being established on the ground. Basically they sent surveyors out here to start surveying the land. Ohio, a lot of it is generally flat in this region. So is Indiana, Illinois. So they're able to easily lay out a nice, neat grid pattern on the map. And when we zoom in further, we see that each of these little squares is about 36 square miles. Each one of these smaller sections is only 1 square mile, which is about 640 acres. So people are buying land at $1 an acre, depending on how much you have, how much you can afford to buy. You'll be sold a portion of one of these squares. If you can buy a whole 640 acres, then you'll get title to an entire section. Most people are only going to be buying smaller portions, like 40 or 80 acres, 100 acres, so forth. What's interesting to note is that the long-term impact of this land ordinance, if you go to Ohio today or just Google up a map or a satellite image of Ohio, you can see that the roads in Ohio are laid out on the same grid pattern today. So the titles and the divisions of the land that they made back in 1785 are still present on the ground today in terms of the county lines and the state highways and so forth. It's all still very neatly arranged today. So it's going to have a very long-term impact in terms of how this land is settled. We'll talk a little bit more about settlement patterns later on here in a minute. A little piece of trivia for you, talking about our path to statehood established by the Northwest Ordinance 1787. Every time we add a new state in these first years, we're going to add an additional star to the flag and an additional stripe as well. So Vermont will be the first state added in 1791, and then Kentucky in 92 and Tennessee in 96. What they realized early on that, of course, they had, if you remember the Revolutionary flag, or the Betsy Ross flag as it's sometimes referred to, there were 13 stars, 13 stripes, one for each of the 13 original states. Well, they realized after Kentucky was added in 92 that it would be impractical to continue adding an additional stripe for each state. So they decided at that point to abandon the additional stripes and just add a new star for every subsequent state. So Kentucky was the last state to be added as both a star and a stripe. Tennessee, when they added Tennessee in 96, they had reduced the stripes back to the original 13 and just added another star. A little bit of flag trivia for you there, just to kind of tie in some cultural pieces as well. One last point I want to make about settlement patterns. This kind of ties into our overarching theme of regional divisions between North and South that'll kind of run through the whole semester. We see as settlers start moving onto the frontier in the late 1700s, early 1800s, we see a pattern start to emerge in terms of how culture is being spread into this territory as well. Typically, as settlers move onto the frontier, they're moving due west. We see very few instances where people from New York are moving down into Tennessee or Mississippi territories, or people from the Carolinas moving up into the Michigan territory. Typically, people just pack up and move onto the frontier. They just head in a generally westerly direction. So what ends up happening is that in addition to their household goods and their possessions and their families and their livestock, they take with them their culture as well. Their standard of living, their means of survival, their occupation, their religion, everything that is theirs goes with them onto the frontier. So we'll see down here in places like South Carolina and Georgia, as people here begin moving west into what will eventually become Alabama and Mississippi, they're taking with them their lifestyle, all of their ways, their culture as well. So Mississippi and Alabama will eventually look exactly like South Carolina and Georgia in terms of local government, culture, economy, to include things like large-scale plantation agriculture worked by primarily slave labor. So we'll see this pattern established here in South Carolina and Georgia will begin moving west with the settlers onto the frontier. Same thing in the Chesapeake area, Virginia, North Carolina. As those people begin moving west, Kentucky and Tennessee will start looking very much like Virginia and North Carolina in terms of the culture we see present there. And then, of course, in Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, in this territory, people moving out of New England into these territories will bring with them their lifestyle and life ways as well. And so Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois will eventually start looking like New York, Pennsylvania, and New England. To include things like the tight-knit sense of community, the small family farms, and education and independent government and all those sort of things that characterize New England will start showing up down here in the frontier as well. So the Ohio River will eventually become kind of a natural boundary between the two primary regional cultures that we saw established in the beginning, our northern cultural region and our southern cultural region. As they start to be transplanted onto the frontier, the Ohio River becomes kind of a de facto boundary between these two regions. And as these two regional characters are transplanted onto the frontier, they will eventually begin competing with each other in several different ways. The first of which, or the most important, is representation in Congress. As new states are added on the frontier, they will send representatives to Congress, and our federal government will start to reflect the regional differences in the country. So when we think in terms of regional agendas, in the north we'll see an emphasis on commerce and trade and industry. In the south we'll see continued emphasis on plantation agriculture. These two forms of economy will become part of the agenda in that region as far as how they're represented in Congress. So we'll see a very competitive relationship developing between these two regions in terms of having their voices heard within the federal government. This will come to shape some of the national issues that will become part of the story leading up to the Civil War. And we see that as kind of an outgrowth of our two regional characters that we saw developing very early on. So it's important to keep some of those cultural things in mind because they will become part of our larger story as we see growing tension between North and South with regards to representation in Congress. All right, our new federal government, this government under the Articles of Confederation, while they don't accomplish much, other than our land ordinances, which organize our frontier, they will be faced with numerous challenges, and this will be part of the reasons why we will see this form of government eventually being abandoned in place of the Constitution. To begin with, these challenges that are going to be faced by our very weak federal government are of quite a bit of variety. We've got diplomatic challenges, we've got economic crises, we have internal political turmoil, a lot of things going on in these first few years of our independence, and a lot of these things are going to create an atmosphere where many people start believing that these Articles of Confederation are just no longer practical, and we need to look at a different way of establishing a federal government. So to begin with, let's talk about a little bit about these diplomatic issues. Per the Treaty of Paris, 1783, England was required to remove all of their troops from American territory. And they did, for the most part. We'll talk about that in a minute. But there's going to be some continued British troops, or presence of British troops on our frontier for many years after the Revolution. And in addition to that, we've got a lot of border disputes with Spain. Spain still controls Florida, but the border between the United States and Spanish Florida is never specified or clarified. So this is going to create a lot of problems with us diplomatically between England and Spain, with regard to our borders. Taking a look at a map here, it's easier to see what we're talking about with our situation with England. England did remove all of their troops from the area of the 13 states, the original 13 states. So from New England all the way down to the Carolinas, England removed all of their troops. All the British troops were pulled out of these United States, but they remained on the frontier areas. As you can see, these dark spots here, little crosses there. There's 7 British forts along the Great Lakes area. Between Great Lakes, of course, is the primary border between the United States and British Canada. Well, these forts are on the United States side of the lakes. So technically, while these are British forts, they are in U.S. territory. Now, the dispute comes. Of course, we told England we want these troops gone, we want these forts gone. England is like, well, these troops are there to protect our frontier border. And while you can make an argument for that, this is the frontier. The weakness of that argument is, okay, who are you protecting your frontier from? The United States? Because the United States poses absolutely no threat to England at this point. The United States is far too weak economically and militarily to pose any kind of threat to British Canada. And of course, why then would those forts be on the United States side of this border? So there's a lot of questions being raised here about the presence of these British troops. The reality of the situation is that the protection of the frontier was just kind of an excuse that England was using to keep these forts here to protect the real prize, which was a lucrative fur trade that England had with the Native Americans living in this region. Prior to the British involved in this fur trade, the French had established this fur trade with the Indians many, many years ago. And after the French and Indian War, England took over this fur trade. It's very profitable. And England, for obvious reasons, doesn't want to give up this fur trade to the United States. But they're just using this frontier security as an excuse to keep these forts here. Now, the problem is that the United States really can't do anything about this. Congress has no power. The only power Congress has is the power to conduct foreign policy, to conduct national defense, and to run the post office. Well, so essentially with the powers that Congress has, all we can do is we can send a letter to England saying that we don't like their forts on our territory, and that's pretty much it. Congress can't raise an army. We can't send troops out here to drive the British out because Congress just does not have that authority to do that. So England knows that our government is weak and they can't do anything about it. So England is in no hurry to remove these troops. And the bottom line is that it makes us look weak. It makes us look weak because we are weak. We are weak by design. These Articles of Confederation are designed specifically to limit the power of the federal government. In this case, though, this weakness puts us at a disadvantage diplomatically because England doesn't really have any respect for our border here because they know we're in no position to really do anything about it. Even if Congress wanted to do something about it, it would be difficult because of where these troops are located. On the frontier of New York and Vermont and Pennsylvania, this Ohio territory. This is a northern concern. There's no British troops on the frontier of the Carolinas or Georgia, so the southern colonies are of little. This is of little concern to them. Even if Congress wanted to try and raise an army, which even if they were allowed to, the southern colonies aren't going to send troops to this army because they don't care about these British troops. It's not their concern. So here again we see some of these regional divisions playing into some of these diplomatic affairs. So we're in a kind of a tough situation here as a nation, losing a little bit of respect here internationally because we just simply cannot defend our own borders. Looking down in the southern part of the United States at the same time, we've got a similar issue or dispute with Spain. Remember, Florida is controlled by Spain at this point. And of course, important to note too that Florida is shaped a little bit differently than it is today. Florida actually extends all the way to the Mississippi River, as displayed on this map. The problem, though, is that the Treaty of Versailles, or Treaty of Paris 1783, did not specify the border between the United States and Spanish Florida. So both sides claim this large territory here in the southwest corner of the map. Spain claims all this as Florida. The United States claims all this as part of their frontier. So both sides have claim to this territory. Neither side can show proof that it's legally theirs. And we're in a situation where, just like with the British troops on the northern frontier, we can't do anything about this because Congress simply has no power to deal with this. All we can do is we can launch a formal protest to the Spanish government saying, we believe that your claims to this territory are not legal. And Spain's like, so what are you going to do about it? And the United States says, well, nothing. We can't raise an army. We can't drive you out of here. We can't defend this border. So there's really nothing we can do about it. And of course, to put this in terms of regional issues, while this dispute with Spain might be very important to Georgia and Tennessee, it's of no consequence to Pennsylvania and New York. They don't care about this border. So even if Congress did have the authority to raise an army, they're going to get no troops from the northern colonies because the northern states will argue that this is no concern of theirs and that Georgia and Tennessee should have to deal with it on their own. And this is kind of the inherent problem with 13 independent states doing 13 different things, is that these states are pretty much left to fend for themselves in terms of these types of international borders here. So we've got some weaknesses here on our northern and southern borders with some of our neighbors of England and Canada and Spanish Florida. We're just not in a situation where we can enforce our own borders, and this makes us look weak in front of our neighbors. On top of all that, on top of these two diplomatic issues that we've got going on, we've got some economic problems. And these are not just little economic problems. This is kind of a major crisis. Right now, as a new nation, we are not in a situation where we produce very many things. There is some small cottage industries and workshops developing in the New England area, but not enough to account for any major exports. So in terms of trade, the United States imports more than it exports. We have a trade deficit. We still rely heavily on imports to meet the demands of our market. This puts us at an economic disadvantage, primarily with England, who is our main trading partner at the time. in addition to this war debt, or excuse me, in addition to this trade deficit, we've got a massive amount of war debt. Both Congress and the individual state governments are saddled with many millions of dollars of debt as a result of the Revolutionary War. This trade deficit and the war debt added together equal an economic recession that is just, it's really preventing us from developing and growing in terms of economic development. So we're in a tight spot economically. So we have very little power to do anything with these diplomatic issues. We have Congress has no power to do anything about this economic recession, because keep in mind the Articles of Confederation specifically prohibit Congress from getting involved with any kind of trade regulation. Congress is not allowed to raise taxes. So all of this economic problems, the individual states will be left to themselves to deal with it on their own, and they get creative. Some states at this point they're just printing money. They're just printing off money like it's notebook paper or something. They're just printing off money that it's not backed by anything, and the currencies, and of course each currencies are getting devalued. Inflation is rampant, and of course you got 13 different states printing off 13 different kinds of money, and these economic problems are going to get out of control if we don't do something about it. But the situation is Congress cannot do anything about it because it simply does not have the authority to act in these types of economic matters. So in the midst of all these problems, we're going to have a catalyst here, something that's going to serve as the last straw, a spark, so to speak, to set off this desire for change and revision in our federal government. In 1786, in the state of Massachusetts, there's going to be a small-scale uprising, a rebellion of farmers on the frontier, led by a guy named Daniel Shays. Now, this rebellion is a direct result of Massachusetts overtaxing its own citizens within its own state. What ends up happening is that Massachusetts, like many of the other colonies, was faced with enormous war debt after the Revolution. And in an attempt to pay off these debts, they began raising taxes. If you remember, near the beginning of the semester, I spoke about the fact that history is often filled with irony, and this is one of my favorite ironies of American history. The state of Massachusetts begins levying higher and higher taxes on its citizens in order to pay off its war debt. They are essentially replicating the same exact situation that they fought a war to get out of during the Revolution. Remember, the Revolution, the independence movement began in Massachusetts, and it began over this issue of taxes. England is levying all these oppressive taxes on us. They're abusing us. We don't want to pay any more British taxes. We need to be independent so we can start oppressing our own people with our own taxes. This is exactly what's happening in the state of Massachusetts. And Daniel Shays and a lot of the frontier farmers are getting hit especially hard with this. At one point, frontier farmers are paying more than 30% of their annual income in taxes, and they just can't survive at that rate. These taxes are very crippling economically. A lot of these people are losing their farms. The farms are being foreclosed on. A lot of people are ending up in prison as a result of not being able to pay their debts. And the farmers reach a breaking point. Daniel Shays, who was himself a veteran of the Revolutionary War, he served as an officer in the Revolution. The irony is not lost on Shays. He's one of the first to point out, is like, okay, we just fought a war to become independent from England because of oppressive taxes. Why then are we doing it to ourselves here in the state of Massachusetts? It's so ironic that it happens here, because this is the very place that spearheaded the whole no taxation without representation movement for independence. So Shays and 2,000 of these frontier farmers will rise up against the Massachusetts state government over these oppressive taxes, and they will. This rebellion will go on for about a year or so. They focus their assault on the courthouses, and in order to prevent a lot of these foreclosures from being filed and completed, so they don't lose their farms. The Massachusetts state government is pretty much helpless to do anything about this, because once this rebellion starts and people start getting killed and things start getting destroyed, normally Massachusetts state government would call up the militia to deal with it. But most of the men who would serve in the militia are serving Daniel Shays in this rebellion. So Massachusetts is at a loss here to deal with this. They don't have any militia troops they can call up. The state government doesn't have enough money to fund any kind of response to this rebellion. So Massachusetts state government reaches out to the federal government. They call up Congress and say, hey, Congress, we got a situation here that we can't deal with. Can you help us out? Congress is like, what do you want us to do about it? We don't have any power. The state government specifically prohibited us from raising an army, from raising taxes, from getting involved in any kind of state affairs. Congress is saying you wanted a weak federal government that wouldn't get involved with your business. Well, guess what? This is your business, and you deal with it on your own. And as you can imagine, too, none of the other state governments are interested in helping Massachusetts because they all say the same thing. They're like, look, Massachusetts, you created this problem for yourself. You have to deal with it yourself. So Massachusetts is in a situation here where their state government is in serious danger of crumbling from within because of internal matters that cannot be addressed. And of course, the federal government has no power to step in and assist the state government here. They are totally on their own. What ends up happening, long story short, is that the Massachusetts state government turns to private investors. Basically, the wealthy elites in Massachusetts donate money to raise a separate army in order to put down this rebellion. Shays himself will escape capture. He'll live in exile in the neighboring states for the rest of his life, but they eventually are able to put down this rebellion, but at great expense to the state in terms of trying to raise money in order to put down this rebellion. So Shays' rebellion serves as kind of it's a red flag moment. A lot of people, on the outside looking in from the other states, and of course from the perspective of Congress, are beginning to realize that, okay, this big list of problems, we've got a whole big list of problems that we got here. We can't defend our own borders against foreign nations. Our economy is in shambles, and these little rebellions, if this sort of thing like Shays' rebellion happens often enough, it could put our nation in serious jeopardy of collapsing because there's just no way to effectively deal with these types of crises because our federal government is so weak. It has no power or authority to deal with any of these things. So Shays' rebellion is just kind of a catalyst. We don't draft a new constitution simply because of Shays' rebellion. Shays' rebellion is just kind of the last straw. It gets people thinking about perhaps revising our federal government to give it a little bit more power. So that's what's going to happen. Same year that Shays' rebellion takes place, a conference was held in Annapolis, Maryland. And the purpose of this conference was to address economic issues, specifically with regard to trade regulations. The meeting in Annapolis was designed to, okay, we're going to get together representatives from the 13 states, and we're going to talk about trade regulations, maybe allowing the federal government to have a hand in regulating trade a little bit more. It was essentially a trade conference, but nobody shows up. Only just a couple of colonies sent representatives to Annapolis in '86 for this trade conference. One of the representatives there, a guy named Alexander Hamilton, who was a banker by trade. Hamilton will eventually rise to prominence within George Washington's administration. But Hamilton, at this point, he's just kind of a financier, a banker. He's here at this trade conference because he believes that it's important to try and get trade among the colonies regulated to a point where they all can prosper from it instead of just running in 13 different directions. But Hamilton was very frustrated by the fact that nobody even showed up to this conference. So Hamilton proposes that they have another conference in 1787, the following year, for the purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation to give the federal government a little bit more power, because clearly no one takes the federal government seriously. the Articles of Confederation make the federal government so weak that the state governments just act as though it doesn't even exist to begin with. So in the spring of 1787, 12 out of the 13 colonies will send representatives to meet here to discuss the idea of revising the Articles of Confederation in order to give the federal government a little bit more power, because clearly circumstances are at this point such that the federal government simply cannot respond to the things that it needs to in an effective way. So so we've got a lot better participation at this conference in Philadelphia in 1787. And while they met with the purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation, what will eventually happen in Philadelphia is that they will decide to completely scrap the Articles of Confederation and draft a brand new constitution, a federal constitution modeled after the state constitutions, wherein the federal government is going to be completely restructured. So it'll be nothing like it was under the Articles of Confederation. One of the first things they do in Philadelphia as the conference convenes is they elect George Washington to preside over this conference. And here we see George Washington's first real foray into politics. Up to this point, we know him as the military leader, the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. But it's at this point where he really becomes involved in politics, and we of course know that he'll be the first president after we reform our federal government. So a committee is appointed to draft a constitution. James Madison will be kind of the head of that committee. If you read the Constitution, a lot of the words you read in the Constitution, this is essentially the work of James Madison. While he did work with a committee, much of it is his own words, in the same way that Thomas Jefferson was the chief architect of the Declaration of Independence. James Madison, of course, will go on to be President of the United States later on. At this point, he's just part of this committee who is drafting the Constitution. And we kind of refer to Madison as the father of the Constitution because, again, he is one of the primary contributors. And our goal with this Constitution, this Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, the primary goal here is to create a stronger, more centralized national government so that we can effectively deal with some of these challenges that are facing us. Diplomatic issues, economic issues, internal political turmoil. A stronger federal government will be better equipped to deal with some of these challenges and crises. And it's in this process of creating a new constitution that we are going to see a shift in power from the state governments to the federal government. Remember, under the Articles of Confederation, all the power rests in the state government. The state governments dominate the federal government. This process of creating a constitution we're going to see a transformation. The federal government is going to now have the dominant portion of the power, and the state governments will be subordinate to the federal government. Right now, it's just the opposite. So this is a significant turning point in our story where we're going to see the federal government become a more prominent form of government in the United States. Specifically, the powers that we're going to give this new federal government is the power to regulate trade, levy taxes, and raise an army. And of course, the federal government will be the only ones printing money as a result of this too, and again, in an attempt to get everybody on the same economic system. So instead of having 13 different types of money circulating, we're only going to have one type of money printed by the federal government. So these are important powers. And each of these powers was given to the federal government specifically to address some of the challenges that we're facing at the time. Regulating trade, getting all 13 colonies working together toward the same economic prosperity. To raise an army in order to defend our borders against foreign encroachment. And of course, levying taxes in an attempt to raise the money that it needs to do all these things. Here's where we're going to leave off for today. When we come back next session, we'll start talking about what exactly is going to be part of this Constitution. What what provisions are we're going to really kind of zoom in on the Constitution itself and look at some of the ideas in the Constitution and the origin of those ideas, some of the issues that drove the creation of the Constitution, and why it ended up specifically the way it did. So we'll pick it up here next time.